Hey guys, it's Chris at Highline Guitars. You're watching another one of my YouTube guitar building videos. If you're new to the channel, welcome. I hope that by the end of this video, I'll have earned your subscription. What I'm going to be going over today is part 17 of my neck through guitar build. And specifically what I'll be talking about is how I drill the holes for the string through ferrules on the back of the guitar. I'm also going to do some finish sanding. And then at the end of the video, I'm going to make the cover for the control cavity. So without further ado, let's jump in and get started. To drill the holes in the guitar body for my string through ferrules, I use a plate with an indexing pin that I can use to register the holes that my CNC drilled on the front side of the guitar with where the holes will need to be on the back side. So I just need to attach that plate to the table on my drill press, and these are held in place with wing nuts, and I'll just lightly tighten those. Then I'll put in the first drill bit that I'm going to use, which in this case is a 5/16 inch bit, which is for that lip on the string through ferrule. Then what I need to do is make sure that the pin is lined up precisely with the center of that drill bit, and that I have enough space between the pin and the top of the bit to position the guitar. So I'll lower the bit down, and I'm using a brad point bit here, and I'll line up that pin, the very tip of that sharp pin, with the tip of the point on the brad point drill bit. Once I have that done, I can tighten the table, and I can also tighten the wing nuts that I use to secure that indexing plate. Then it's just a matter of carefully positioning the guitar so that that pin goes into the holes that the CNC machine drilled on the front of the guitar. Then I can start to make the shallow recesses with that 5/16 inch bit into the back of the guitar. And then I just need to carefully lift the body and reposition that pin into the next hole. And it takes a little bit of care when doing this, because I don't want either the bit or the pin to mar the surface of the guitar, which is one of the reasons why I do this work now before I apply the finish. But then once I have drilled all these shallow recesses for each of the string through ferrules, what I'll have to do next is replace the 5/16 inch bit with a 1/4 inch bit to drill the hole deeper into the body, which will accommodate the body of the ferrule itself. So there's basically going to be 3 bits involved here: the 5/16 inch for the lip of the ferrule, the 1/4 inch for the body of the ferrule, and then about 1/8 of an inch that goes all the way through the rest of the body to the bridge. Now, I know some of you are going to be wondering, why didn't I drill all these holes with my CNC machine? Well, there's a couple of reasons for that. First of all, I don't have collets for all the different size bits that I use here. And as a result, I can't use the 5/16 inch bit to drill those holes into the back of the body. And also, when I was planning this build, I really wasn't sure if I was going to use a string through hardtail bridge or a top loader. So I could drill the top holes, but I didn't want to drill the back holes if I was going to end up installing a top loader bridge. Well, I ended up deciding to use the string through bridge, and that meant I had to go back later on after the guitar was further along in order to drill those string through holes. And here I'm drilling the last hole, which is an 1/8 inch diameter, and that basically connects the top holes, which were only a 1/2 inch deep, with the holes that I just drilled in the back of the body for the string through ferrules. And this is what the end result looks like, perfectly registered. In the last episode, which was part 16 of this build, I had done the pre-assembly, and prior to the pre-assembly, I sanded the entire body and the neck shaft and headstock with 220 grit sandpaper. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to take it up to a progressively finer grits. So I am sanding right now with 320 grit. Then I'm going to jump to 400 and I'll finish with 600. I'm using all P grade sandpapers. I always use P grade sandpapers, and you know they're P grade because they have the letter P in front of the grit designation. That's the European standard for abrasives, and they're, in my opinion, superior because the grains that they use are more consistent in their shape and size, so you get a better quality sanding surface as you work up through the grits. So I'll go with, right now, the 320 grit, and then, like I said, I'll move through 400 and 600. Some folks will tell you that when you're going to be applying a finish, especially if you're going to be applying a stain color, you should stop at 150 or 220 in order to get the stain to absorb more readily into the wood. That's really only true, I have found, when you're using a cheaper quality oil-based stains. I don't do that. I typically, if I'm going to apply a transparent color to the wood, I'll use an aniline dye, such as Keta dyes or Trans-Tint, and I'll mix those into denatured alcohol before I apply it to the wood. And I can sand all the way up to, I've gone as high as 1500 grit, and they will still absorb readily into the wood. But the reason why I like to go up to 600 when I'm sanding is because I can see sanding scratches in the wood through 320 and 400 grit. Once I start to get up in the 600, even 800 grit range, I can no longer see the sanding scratches, so I get a better quality finish. Now with this guitar, I'm just going to go with a natural polymerized tung oil finish on the wood. I'm not going to be applying any color to it. So I can sand to about 600 or even 800. And when I apply that finish, I'm not going to be able to see any sanding scratches in the wood, and it's just going to look a lot better. As I work my way up through the grits from 320 to 600, one of the things I try to do is to make sure that I'm always using the same brand. And I try to avoid mixing different brands because that can introduce potential problems like pesky sanding scratches. And you're not always going to be able to tell how those scratches occurred and at what grit. So if you maintain the same brand through each grit designation as you work up, then you're going to be assured of a better quality finish. And the brands that I recommend, the ones that I've had the best luck with, are 3M, Norton, Eagle Abrasives, and Klingspor products. So as long as you stick to the same brand through the entire process, any one of those brands is going to give you outstanding results. So how do you know when it's time to move from one grit to the next? What you want to do as you're sanding is occasionally stop and then hold the guitar up to a bright overhead light at a low angle and check the surface. And what you're looking for is the sanding scratches that are on the surface, because all sandpapers, regardless of their grit, are going to leave a scratch pattern. And the severity of that scratch pattern depends on the grit. So obviously a 220 grit is going to leave a more severe scratch pattern than a 320, and 400 will be even lighter. So what you're looking for is to cover the entire surface that you're sanding with a consistent scratch pattern that is associated with the grit that you're sanding with. So after you've been sanding for a while and you're checking the surface, once you've noticed that the entire surface looks like it has a pretty consistent scratch pattern, then you can move on to the next grit. And as you sand that, you want to sand in just a small area and then check that. And you'll notice that that area is going to start to look smoother than the adjacent areas. Well, once you've got all the adjacent areas sanded to that same consistent scratch pattern, then you're ready to move on to the next grit. Now, when sanding with 320 grit, I'm not going to be changing any of the surface shapes, so my roundovers aren't going to change. However, at this stage, I do want to check to make sure that any roundovers, bevels, contours, carved shapes are consistent. And if they aren't, I can go back to 220 or even 150 to correct any issues that I see. And one of the ways that you can check to make sure that they're consistent is to use that bright light to check and see how the light and shadow plays across that surface. And if you see any inconsistency, sharp edges, bumps, dips, whatever, you can correct those by going back to your 220 or 150 grit and then working back up to the 320. But at 320 and beyond, it's not going to change the shape much unless you're a total maniac when it comes to sanding. Even at 320 grit, I want to try to sand in the direction of the grain, but that's not always possible in certain hard to reach areas. But in truth, with 320 and beyond, it's going to be very difficult to see the direction of the sanding scratches. And one of the reasons why we sand in the direction of the grain is because the grain helps to conceal those sanding scratches. But like I said, from 320 grit and beyond, it's going to be very difficult to see those scratches anyways. So I can cheat a little bit and sand against the grain if necessary in some of these hard to reach spots. Most of the sanding I do, I use these rubber dollar store giant erasers as a sanding block because they work really well and they conform to the curves that I'm sanding, and that makes it convenient and it's affordable. However, there are occasions when I have to switch to a harder block of wood. So what I've done is I've cut the block of wood to match the same shape as the rubber eraser. That way I can use the same shape of sandpaper, and this just makes it more efficient when it comes to cutting up a sheet of sandpaper. I can cut it up into pieces that are all the same size, and I can use it either with the rubber eraser or with the wooden block. But this is a good example of why I need to switch to a wooden block. I've got two different species of wood here. One is a very hard wood, which is this maple. The other is softer, which is mahogany. So getting the two surfaces smooth and consistent so you can't feel the seam requires the use of a hard block of wood. If I were to use the rubber sanding block, it's going to conform to the shape of both woods and sand away the softer wood at the same rate as the harder wood. So I can never get the two quite smooth and consistent. So I'm going to use the harder sanding block, and that's going to remove the maple and bring it down consistent with the mahogany. Okay, so I've got my gloves on, and you'll see why in a minute. But if you look closely, you may notice there is some tear out here. And this was unavoidable. This is because of a very loose grain and pore structure in this part of the wood. And when I cut it with the CNC machine, it tore out some of that wood, and there's no way to sand that out. So what I have to do is fill it. And this is a fairly small area. So the way I like to fill is I will use some thin CA glue, and I'll apply just a small amount on my glove here, and then I will wipe it down onto the surface of the wood. And then I'm going to take some 220 grit sandpaper and sand it. And what that's going to do is it's going to work up dust, which is going to fill that tear out. And you can do the same thing on scratches, gouges, nicks, dings, uneven seams, stuff like that. And it just takes going over it a few times until it fills in. See, it's gradually going away with each application of the glue. There, completely filled in, invisible. And once I put my tung oil finish over the top of it, you will never know that there was a little bit of tear out in there. After sanding with each grit, I like to wipe down the surface of the guitar with a tack cloth to remove as much of the dust as I can. And then, once that has been completed, and I'm pretty certain that I've got as much, if not all of the dust off that I can, the next thing I'm going to do is clean the surface with odorless mineral spirits. And this is actually going to do a couple of things. First of all, it's going to remove a lot of the sanding dust that remains, but it's also going to darken the wood. And what that will do is it helps to reveal flaws that are in the surface that you might not have seen during your sanding process. So what I will typically do is I'll work one area at a time. So I'll do like the top first, and then I'll do the sides and then the back. But this helps me to see, because you can see how much darker the wood gets. It's almost like what it will look like when I put stain down on the surface. But everything's looking pretty good. I'm not seeing any severe scratches on the surface. And it's important to carefully inspect every surface, because any flaw that remains, you will see later on at some point. Maybe not right away, but eventually. And I have some tool marks left in this spot here, so I'm going to have to sand that. And what I'll do is I'll just go back in and hit it with some 220, 320, 400, and then I'll work it up to 600. But the rest of it's looking pretty good. I'm not seeing any significant scratches on the surface at all. So I'm pretty happy with that. And until the mineral spirits completely evaporates, you get kind of an idea of how the guitar is going to look once I apply the polymerized tung oil finish, which I will be doing very shortly after I completely finish sanding it. But I think that's looking pretty good. This is a pretty good idea of how it's going to look. I have one more part that I need to fabricate, and that is the cover for the control cavity. And to do that, I'm using an 1/8 inch thick piece of flamed maple. And what I want to do is I want to inlay my Highline Guitars logo into the surface. So I used a plugin that's part of Inventable's easel software that's called Inlay Generator. And with that plugin, I can take the design of my logo and create the files necessary to cut the pocket as well as the inlay itself. And it's really easy to use, and what's cool about it is you can control the size of your inlay components so that it fits into the pocket that was carved to hold the inlay. So it's going to be producing two parts, and one part is the one you see here, which is the actual control cavity cover that's going to have my logo carved as the inlay pocket. And then the mounting holes and the perimeter of the cover are cut. Now the next operation is going to be cut out of contrasting wood, and here I'm using a piece of Cataloche, which is almost black in color. So what's going to happen here is it's going to cut out a mirror image of my logo, and this is the part that will fit into the pocket to create the inlay. I know this probably doesn't make a lot of sense now, but I think you'll see here in a minute exactly how this works, and it's pretty cool. So what I ended up with is the pocket for the inlay, which is routed into the control cavity cover itself. And then in a separate piece of wood, I've carved out the inlay, which is a mirror image of the design. And the way this works is I'm going to flood this inlay pocket with glue, and then I will glue the inlay itself right into the pocket. And now I'll just let that dry for a few hours, and then I'm going to shave off this piece of excess wood, probably with my bandsaw. Okay, so I changed my mind. I decided not to use the bandsaw. Instead, I'm just going to run the piece through my planer. But to do that, I need to attach it to a thicker piece of wood, so I'm just going to use the masking tape and CA glue trick. So basically it just means putting a couple of pieces of masking tape on one board and then a couple of pieces of masking tape on the control cavity cover itself. Next, I'll apply CA glue to the masking tape that's on the inside of the control cavity cover. Then I'm going to spray some accelerator onto the other board and then slap the two together and wait till it dries. And the rest is pretty self-explanatory as I run the front of the control cavity cover through my planer and skim off that piece of wood. And as you can see here, it does it pretty efficiently. And then the last bit of work I have to do is just some light sanding to make sure that the cover fits perfectly into the recess. All right, guys, well, that's all the time I've got for this episode. In part 18, I'm going to apply the finish on this guitar. And that's going to involve doing a little bit of finish testing because I haven't really decided for sure what finish I'm going to use. I'm either going to try Sutherland Wells polymerized tung oil wiping varnish, or I may try another finish that I've used in the past, and that is Z-Epoxy finishing resin. I just need to do a little bit of testing before I decide, and that's what I'll be doing in part 18. So I hope you enjoyed this episode. And again, if you're new, welcome. I hope that I've earned your subscription. And if you found something useful in this video, give it a thumbs up. That always helps. And until the next episode, take care, stay safe, and I hope you'll be back for the next episode.